I'd like to consider models of government behavior. We've had models that describe how consumers behave. We've had models that describe how firms behave. We've had models describe how workers behave. We've had models that describe how they all interact. But we haven't had models of how government behaves. And after all, government consists of people making decisions, motivated in different ways. So there's, at least conceptually, the idea that we should have models of government behavior as well. But why do we need to have this? Why are we worried about it, except that the fact that we've done that with consumers and workers and firms? One reason is that our models of firms and consumers, which have formed the basis for our normative analysis of government so far, our normative meaning what government should do, they don't always work. We've shown what the government should do in the case of a market failure. Almost all of our analysis of normative role for government has been the case of market failure. But models of government behavior can be useful to go beyond this because in many cases these normative recommendations, as we've hinted at from time to time, aren't often followed. They're ignored or something else is done. Or it doesn't work very well. The government intervention, maybe antitrust or regulation of externalities, doesn't work all the time. There seems to be government failures sometimes too, just like market failures. So in a sense, we need an analysis of what government actually does, not only what they should do based on the economic analysis. And what's fascinating and interesting actually is that we can use the same kind of tools and the same kind of ideas to analyze government and therefore get a sense of when and why government fails and when it works, when it doesn't fail. Use the same tools as we used to examine firms, consumers, and workers. So that's what we want to do here. Let's begin with voting. In a democracy, decisions about what government does are supposed to be determined, at least to some degree, by the voters. And so often when you examine government behavior, you want to examine how voting works. So kind of the first step, if you like, not the only part of models of government behavior, but as part of it, models of voting. And there's a different way that economists and political scientists have come at this. One is to start with the simplest possible case where everyone in a society agrees with what should be done. That would be a single issue, maybe the only issue that's relevant is national defense, and everybody agrees there should be 3% of GDP spent on defense, whatever it happens to be. Then in this case, there's not much question. The politicians will choose to do the unanimous view. If they choose something else, then someone else will choose the unanimous view, and the people who choose not to will not get elected. So in a democracy where the politicians would like to win, get elected, there's going to be the easiest case here is they will choose what everybody thinks should be done. Next easiest case is where there are differences of opinion, but there's still just one issue. It could be national defense again. It could be that some people want to have big defense department, other ones have a little defense department, say maybe 1% of GDP at the low level or 6% of GDP at the high level. What happens now is most likely that the politicians will choose what the median voter would like to. Somewhere in the middle, between 50% would be on one side of the issue, 50% on the other side of the issue. That's what the median voter thinks. In this case, what we would argue is that the politician will choose what the median voter wants. It'll ignore the extremes because if it deviated from the median, it would lose more votes than it gains. It would move away from this median and lose people who would otherwise vote for this politician. If it moved either side of the median, either to less defense as a fraction of GDP or more defense as a fraction of GDP compared to the median, it would get fewer votes. That politician would get fewer votes. That party would get fewer votes than it was at the median. So those are a couple of the easier cases. And the outcome is not so bad. You either do exactly what the people would like or you do what the median would like. Not always the right decision in the case of differences of opinion, but a reasonable outcome. But it doesn't always work this way. And life gets difficult when there is more than one issue, which of course is all the time. There's not only defense, there's the economy, there's social issues, there's issues related to the environment, there's issues related to income distribution. There's lots of different issues that government has a role in, as we've seen. And so the decision about what the government will do in these cases is more complicated. And it leads to these voting paradoxes, which is really not a good thing to have. You'd rather not have it, but sometimes you have it. Easiest illustration of this is where you just have 3 voters and 3 issues, and you see what happens. And what it can do is cause really cycles. Basically, the voting will lead to different outcomes in different times. I want to illustrate this with an example. So let's suppose there's 3 people, Max and Meredith and Seth, and the issue is how loud music should be played. Maybe it's a community and it's a mall. How loud should the music be played at the mall? And Max has preferences. He'd like it to be softer. That's his first choice. And he'd like it to be the same as it has been recently. It's a second choice. And his third choice is they turn up the volume compared to what it has been at the shopping mall. Meredith also has preferences. She'd like it to remain the same. That's her first choice. Her second choice is she'd like to turn it up and make it louder. The third choice is to turn it down. Seth, he'd like to be louder. He really likes the loud stuff. Second choice, though, is softer, and the last thing is to keep it the same. He wants some kind of a change. So what would happen now? So suppose they had to vote on whether it should be softer or the same, or suppose they had to vote on whether it should be the same or louder, or same or softer. Suppose it was set up between 2 different things. So for example, suppose the vote is, well, should it be louder? Should it be the same? And suppose if it's softer versus the same, well, softer is going to win because Max prefers softer to same, Seth prefers softer to the same, and so they win 2-1 against Meredith, who prefers same to softer. What if you now change it to same to louder? Well, in this case, same is going to win because Max likes same better than louder, and Meredith likes same better than louder, and Seth likes louder better than same, so they're going to win 2-1. Now, paradoxically in this case, if you now do it softer versus louder, you're going to have softer win because softer is preferred to. You're going to have the louder wins because softer is preferred to louder by Max, but louder is preferred to softer by Meredith and Seth. So it's going to win 2-1. So there's a flipping, if you like, from whether it's same, louder, or softer, and that's what this is. Cycle causes. So if it's softer versus the same, softer wins. If it's the same versus louder, same wins. If it's softer versus louder, louder wins. So it creates a cycle. It depends really on how you set it up, and that makes, you could imagine that the policy changes will tend to fluctuate depending on how the voting is actually conducted. So that's the voting paradox, if you like. And if you now think about this in more general terms, it turns out that an economist, Kenneth Arrow, who's been at Stanford University for most of his career, he, many years ago, found a theorem called an Arrow impossibility theorem that there's no voting scheme that can work for 3 or more alternatives, as in the voting paradox. The voting paradox is really what happens most often. And what he showed is you can't have a voting scheme with what are apparently reasonable properties. One is that there's transitivity. That means if A beats B and B beats C, then A beats C in a race or in a voting scheme. You want to have that. Seems like common sense. If A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C, you think A should be preferred to C. That doesn't always happen to voting schemes, but you'd like that to happen. You also like to have unanimity, that if A is preferred to B for everyone, then there'll be an outcome with A better than B. And then you also want to have a situation where some completely irrelevant thing, say C, or something nothing to do with the vote, doesn't affect what outcome occurs. Makes sense not to have irrelevant alternatives mattering. And then finally, you want to have this done in a democracy, so the dictator can't just determine it. It turns out that it's not possible to have a voting scheme which has all three of these, which in the case of there's 3 or more alternatives, has all 4 of these reasonable properties. So that's the Arrow impossibility theorem, and in this case, it illustrates the problem sometimes of reaching good decisions when the government has been decided that that's how the good is going to be produced. There's other issues that occur in the case of government. If you like, what we're trying to do is consider models of government behavior. There's an idea called public choice models, which has as its basic assumption that politicians, people who work for the government, are motivated by personal gain, just like everyone else in the models we've considered. The firms maximizing profits, consumers maximizing utility. In this case, you can assume the politicians in the government, they want to maximize their gain too. Motivate their personal gain is what's driving them, motivation, just like everybody else. Politicians want to get elected, government workers want to increase their power or prestige. So you can see that in a world like this, you're not always going to get, say, cost-benefit analysis being the way that the analysis of a public good is decided. You're not always going to get a decision that you'll get an extra police car if the marginal benefits are greater than the marginal costs. You might find a politician who realizes he can get more votes, or she can get more votes with that extra police car, even though the marginal benefits might be lower than the marginal costs. Or put more police on the streets might sound good to a politician to get elected, but it actually might not be worth it in terms of marginal benefits and marginal costs. So when you bring public choice into account, you'll see some deviations from what we think the analysis is based on economics. Various ways that this happens. There's special interests, and the special interests occur when people exert heavy political pressure in favor of some spending program or a tax program. Again, it may be more security in the police force. It could be national security. It could be other things. It could be just actually economic benefits. One common example where this occurs is where the benefits from a policy are concentrated on a few, usually firms, and the costs are diffuse throughout the society, frequently on the consumers. An example of this is a sugar quota, which restricts the amount of sugar that can be imported into the United States. Well, that will tend to raise the price of sugar in the United States by reducing competition. Now, each consumer benefits a little bit, would benefit a little bit from removing the sugar quota. The costs are about $5 a year, economists estimate. On the other hand, the sugar growers, they benefit quite a bit from this sugar quota, maybe about $100,000 a year. So each of them will lobby very hard, work very hard to maintain the sugar quota, where it's really not worth the effort for many consumers because they only save, say, $5 per year. And so when you bring in the special interest idea, you realize that it's not simply enough to say that the sugar quota has inefficiencies and gets us off the optimum amount of sugar and the lowest cost for consumers. You have to think about these other forces. The forces that make this happen are sometimes called lobbying, where you have representatives in Washington or in state capitals, representatives of firms or other interests who try to make the case for the policy which will help them. These lobbyists are highly skilled, smart individuals, well-connected individuals. They could probably be doing something else more useful if you didn't have to do the lobbying. And this activity of lobbying is sometimes called by economists rent-seeking. It's like you're trying to get a better deal. You're seeking higher rents, if you like. It's an unusual term, but it simply means this wasteful lobbying that is exerted because of these special interests. And again, you're getting this idea through thinking of government, a model of government describing how individuals behave. And finally, what can happen sometimes is called regulatory capture. This occurs often in the case of regulation of an industry. We've made arguments here about, in the case of a natural monopoly, that there's a role for government in regulating the price to get the price lower than the monopoly price. Or regulated monopolies would be utilities providing electricity or natural gas in a neighborhood, as are natural monopolies. Well, it turns out that railroads were originally regulated as a natural monopoly because they provided the only reasonably fast service between cities when they were when the rails were first laid. So it was kind of a natural monopoly, and therefore the government regulated it. Over time, there became competition from other forms of transportation, trucks on fast highways, airplanes with efficient airports, and effectively they eliminated this natural monopoly. There was other ways to ship goods and ship people between the cities and the country. But as this competition grew, it put pressure on prices, but nonetheless the regulation continued. And in fact, indeed, it started to expand in some of the areas which were not even natural monopolies at all, such as trucking. So what was happening here is the railroads realized that they were benefiting from the regulation, originally set up as a way to keep their prices below the monopoly. They're now actually creating a situation where they were reducing the competition by regulating trucking or by keeping the price of railroads and trucking higher. And what eventually happened is people said, hey, this doesn't make any sense, and the regulation ended. But all during this period, what happened was the railroads effectively had captured the government, had captured the regulators. They had persuaded them that they should keep this regulation, which they benefited from. The capture can occur in many different ways. It may be because the people working in the government would eventually take jobs with the railroads in the private sector, revolving door that's sometimes called. And so they would maybe be a little more lenient about the regulations or continue the regulations beyond when they were required. So this is an example where when you think about what's motivating government employees, government workers, it may be that they would like to get a promotion or they'd like to get a job in the private sector eventually. Not all would, of course. That doesn't describe everybody, but it's a tendency. And it's another reason where you get a different answer if you consider the model of government behavior, what's actually being done, as distinct from the ideal, what should be done. So there's always this tension when you consider public policy. The best thing to deal with this tension is to make the economic arguments as clearly as possible, to communicate them as clearly as possible, and in fact to sometimes set up structures. So for example, the consumers who would benefit just a little from eliminating the sugar quota have more ability to communicate, to form groups themselves that offset the communication skills and the lobbyists of the industry. So when you bring all these other things into account, you see a much richer, in some sense more difficult, but in some sense more interesting public policy problem, which combines the economic analysis, which we have stressed, for what consumers do and workers do and firms do, and now have added in this other element of what governments do, and it gives us a better chance to get hold of these issues and improve public policy. Thank you.